Hello, welcome to the next installment of our Life Unleashed content series. So, today we are talking about a big, scary F word failure. And if you're just joining us, I would encourage you to go into the YouTube comment section and let us know who you are, where you're from. And since we're talking about failure today, if you would be willing, share something that you are afraid to fail at. And while we're waiting for some responses to come in, let me give you a little bit more context about this series. So, when so many of us learn about financial independence and personal finance, we think with an all or nothing mindset, right? So we think either I'm fully set financially and I never need to work again, or I have to work long hours and grind it out at a job that I hate, right? And it seems like there's no gray area. But on this channel, we like to talk about that gray area. There's so much of it between those two options. And if you're here, if you're here live or you're watching the replay, the likelihood is that you have a lot more options than you think. Whether you are paying off debt, whether you have some solid emergency savings, FU money, or if you've reached Coast-Fi or beyond, you have options. And when we realize that we have options, it can be really scary and overwhelming and bring up a lot of fears. And one of those particular fears that plagues us is the fear of failure. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So if you are here and just joining us, I'll say one more time, please go introduce yourself. Let us know who you are, where you're from, and one thing that you are afraid to fail at. Kamran, I'm going to do a full introduction of you in a quick second. But I would love to ask you, what's your name? Where are you from? And what's one thing that you're afraid to fail at?
Sure. Well, it's nice to be here. So my name is Kamran, and I'm based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And I think one thing I'm afraid to fail at recently, I would say, is is some of the stuff I'm doing with contracting, which we'll get into.
Yep, yep. So I can introduce myself too. Most of you know me. I'm Jess. I am currently outside Bend, Oregon. Um, and in the woods, you can see some trees behind me. And we were finally getting service to work, so hopefully we will stay good for this whole session. One thing that I'm afraid to fail at, just tongue in cheek, would be that our internet's not gonna work for this session. But in general, I would say something that I'm afraid to fail at is, I would say just like that my business falls completely flat and that like my husband and I both have to go back to work at full-time jobs. That's something that I'm afraid to fail at. I see we have Denise here from Baltimore, Maryland, who says that she's afraid of failing at life. I think that's a big one, right? It's like we're sort of afraid to fail at everything. So Denise, thanks for sharing that. So for those of you who are just joining us, go introduce yourself. And if it's too like vulnerable to share something that you're afraid of failing at, that's okay. Just tell us who you are, and where you're coming from today. So today we're going to dive into failure. And I decided that I wanted to talk to Kamran about this. So Kamran Ayub. And Kamran has been a member of our community for many years. He is not a personal finance blogger or content creator. So I think that makes him really unique, that a lot of people who, are actually willing to talk about this stuff are already content creators. But Kamran is a regular, awesome guy. Quit his corporate job in 2022 to start a solo consulting practice to help tech companies with developer education, which he says, his quote, failed miserably, which led him to where he is today. And I've gotten a front row seat to all of this failure, or what I would prefer to call experimentation, because I've worked with Kamran as a client since 2021. So he first participated in Design a Life You Love, and then has been part of my mastermind and accountability program. And then so I've gotten to see Kamran negotiate the summer off of his corporate job, experiment with multiple different business ideas and income streams, decide to quit his full time job, focus on consulting, fail and learn a lot, and then pivot. But I'm not going to tell all of you the end of the story. We're going to talk about that failure and that hard, challenging middle. And then I'm going to let him share with you how it's evolved at the end of the conversation. So, Kamran, welcome to Life Unleashed.
Thanks. I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. So, I see a couple other people in the comments. So, we have Danielle from Michigan, who says, afraid to fail at making the most of the time I get in life.
Mm,
Um, yeah, that's a huge one. And
mhm,
then afraid to fail at finding financial security and independence outside of consulting.
mhm,
And then Amanda from Massachusetts, afraid of failing at living life outside of a high income, high stress corporate life. So those are all definitely um, tough ones that we, are going to help talk through today.
mhm.
So before we jump into the conversation, I want to do a quick poll here. And I want to hear from you and I want to see in the comments, has a fear of failure ever held you back from creating the life that you want? If you say yes to that, like if that feels true to you, put a 1 in the chat. If that doesn't feel true at all and you've never had fears of failure that have held you back, put a 2 in the chat. I would say number 1 for me, absolutely. But yeah, go ahead, put your number 1 or your number 2 in that chat to let us know. Have you had this fear of failure that's held you back? I'm seeing some ones in that chat. So Kamran, you and me, we are not alone here.
Yep.
Uh,
Hanging, holding up my hand
Hold
for
it, yeah,
number
I hold
one.
up my
Yep.
number 1 here for sure. So and actually one thing that I like to say is, like I feel like some people like early on in my journey, I looked at people who had these like really awesome and interesting lives and I was like, wow, these people must be just like fearless and like larger than life and like it's so much different from me. And then I like met a bunch of them and realized like, no, they're really just as afraid as the rest of us. They've just figured out how to like deal with and manage and like, I don't know if it's like, yeah, that we can like it's like they could tolerate it. It's like we
Mhm.
can tolerate the discomfort and move through it.
Manage.
Um,
Yeah, manage is a good
yeah.
word for it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, and it doesn't mean that it's, like, that feels good in the moment, and that's what we're gonna dive into in a second, is that, like, feeling like we're failing is really not fun, um, and we can come out, on the other side of it, as well. So, Kamran, I wanna dive in. So, after you quit your corporate job so you quit your corporate job about
May 2022.
May 2022. Okay, okay,
Yep.
so, it's been about a couple of years then.
Yes, it's been more
Um,
than 2 years now.
wow, yeah, and so you tried a lot of things, and in, like, the first year, you recently, shared that, like, in your reflection of your first year that you felt like you just failed miserably.
Mhm.
And so I would love to hear. So in layman's terms, I know you're a developer, and so you have a lot of language that some of us are not gonna understand, but can you tell us more about, like, what you failed at?
Sure. Yeah, so I guess to set the stage here, so I worked at Target and I was an engineer. So I was doing software development. And it's funny because, throughout the Design a Life You Love workshop that we did, I would consistently rate my work experience pretty well. Like, I think I was rating it a 7 or 8 out of 10. So I was in a situation where I was doing pretty good at work and it was going really well. So it brought up the question, like, why quit, right? Like, why quit such a nice cushy corporate job? I was making quite a bit of money, right? So I mean, software engineers make quite a bit, and I was 12 years into my career, right? So I think so part of it was I wanted to focus on family. And my wife works at a school, so she works against an academic calendar. And so she's not a teacher, but she does work in the school. And so she gets summers off. And so the past like 2 years of my job, I'd wanted to do summers off. And so I had requested a leave of absence and that got approved. So I was able to do that once. And then for the next year, basically the thinking was, well, they're probably not going to give me another summer off, so I probably need to do something else. And so I thought, well, I guess it's about time to quit. So that's what I did. And then at that point I had a couple choices. So I have been working on an app for a long time, and I could try to grow that, but it's really small. It wasn't really generating much revenue, and so I knew that that would take a long time to build. So that was like on my back burner of like, well, I could be working on that, and I would like to grow that after the year that I quit. But in the meantime, I did have a client that I'd worked with for a long time doing freelance. So even before I quit, I'd been doing stuff on the side. So I'd been doing moonlighting for a client doing technical content creation. So, like creating articles or creating videos around technical content. And then I had also been doing contracting with a company to do training for software developers. So, again, more technical content and creation. And so I had these three options ahead of me of like, what do I do after I quit? And I decided that I would want to just go all in on working with clients, because that had been earning money. And I thought that I could grow that because it seems like there was demand at the time. And that didn't work out. And there's a lot of stuff that happened in between, like quitting and and then realizing that it was failing, because it was not a realization that happened even within the first 2 or 3 months. It happened more around the 6 to 8 month mark. Um, and at that time, since we had planned to quit, we had a runway built up. And so I would say like the first 3 or 4 months were great. Like it was like, oh, this is so much nicer having this freedom to do what I want, to build a business that I want to. And then around the 6 to 8 month mark, it was like, I'm not really seeing the results I expected. And so maybe it's time to do a pivot, but I didn't execute that pivot until about a year into it.
Mhm. Yeah, I'm thinking back and I I feel like a couple of things that I'm remembering are, you did a contract that was focused on like, "Hey, here's a specific
Hmm.
deliverable that I'm gonna give you for a certain amount of money."
Yes.
But then it ended up taking, like, way, 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 way longer than you expected, and so you
Yes.
were working, like, way more than, what you were getting paid for, which, is definitely a challenge.
Yeah.
Um
And it's funny because it was a like overall it felt like a failure, but if you examine some of the individual milestones that I made, I mean, I landed a 5 figure deal and closed it within
Mhm,
a few weeks right after quitting, which is a pretty big milestone from someone who's never done a 5 figure deal ever. Um, and I was able to work with that client for almost a year and a half, even after that. And we completed all the stuff that we did. It took longer, but I was able to complete it.
mhm,
Um, and I also, even during that time, still managed to land another client. So it's not like it was a complete failure, but it didn't lead to some of the results that I expected, because I had expected to have a pipeline of people coming to me and putting out proposals and stuff left and right, and that didn't happen. And
Mm.
it was so much stuff that I had to learn too. Like, uh, I think maybe some of the audience might be familiar with the Mad Scientist, and he did a lot of what he called ultra learning. And I think there's maybe even a book called Ultra Learning. I haven't read it, but that's what I would say is what happened during the first year was just a lot of ultra learning of like, how do I do sales? How do I do marketing? How do I sell myself? How do I sell my services? What kind of services should I offer? How should I position myself in the market? And then coming to the realization of like, oh, okay, well, the demand that I thought was there is not actually there, or the clients that I could work with maybe aren't the type of clients that I actually enjoy working with, which was like a realization that came later. Um, and so there's just a lot of that, and there was a lot of that fear along the way of like, okay, well, I need we're going to run out of runway, right? So what am I going to do to maintain that? How are we going to deal with that? And then there was lots of stuff happening behind the scenes too, of like, I have 3 kids and they're all really young. One of them was in public school, but he was just in kindergarten, so he was going through kindergarten. And then my other 2 were in daycare, so the scheduling was really crazy. And so there's just a lot of stuff that I learned about my situation and then about myself that sort of led into like, okay, well, maybe consulting just isn't a good fit for me right now in this season of life I'm in.
Mhm. Right, so it's sort of this combination of, like, realizing, like, "Oh, I needed to do all this learning to figure
Yep.
it out, and
Hmm.
I'm learning that, like, this isn't maybe exactly like, this isn't working as well as I want it to be," as well as stuff going on outside of work with family that
Yep.
just puts constraints on the amount of time that you had to build a new business.
Yep. That's right.
Yeah, yeah, and that, when you quit, you had like, "Oh, I have these 3 options in front of me," and in some ways, like, you chose the hardest one.
I did. I chose what we say is I was playing on hard mode. So that's
Mhm.
probably not a great idea to do when you don't have, like, if you're not financially independent, right? And I'm not. But
Mhm,
I had a runway, but it wasn't really enough to like fully start something from scratch. Because I
mhm,
think what I learned is that maybe you should have almost a year or even a year or more worth of runway if you really want to start something from scratch to give yourself enough
mhm.
time for it to
Yeah.
grow. And I had chosen something that was outside my area of expertise, like market wise. So my fit with the market wasn't that great, because it was a lot of startups. And I'm not based in Silicon Valley, based in the Midwest. So there's already that sort of like outsider feeling to it. I didn't really know too many people in, like, besides my client. Like, networking was hard. It was, so I was definitely playing on hard mode. So
Mhm.
that's something that I know better now, and what I learned from
Mhm.
it is like, okay, I
Yeah.
need to actually be thinking about how well do I fit
Mhm.
with the market?
Yeah.
How well does my offer fit with my audience? And doing all this research up front before jumping into
Mhm.
trying to build a new business around it.
Mhm. So, okay, so I would love to share from an outside perspective. Like, as you were going through this and learning a lot, from an outside perspective, I was like, wow, like you are taking courageous action to test things out and to experiment and to like figure out what's working. And in some ways, like that's what's required when you're designing the life that you want, right? Like those are it seem to from the outside perspective, like, those are things that I don't think you could have learned without doing them,
Yep. Yep.
Or, like, there's we can only prepare ourselves so much for something, like, we actually have to just, like, jump into it and take the action, and then we, like, get all of these gems of learning that
Yeah.
help us to move forward. However, right? So that's the outside perspective, right? That I'm seeing this and I'm saying like, wow, Kamran is such a badass and like doing these things. And at the same time, right? Like and you could probably theoretically, right, be like, "Yeah, I think I'm a badass," like, doing these things, playing on hard mode, like, doing the experiments, learning from them and such. And, right, it also doesn't mean that it felt good, right?
No,
Or
it
or
yeah, I
that
mean it.
you didn't feel like you were failing, and that's what I yeah, and that's one thing that I wanna talk about because you said something as you were sharing more about this session was like, we see a lot of success washing on
Mhm.
social media where we say, like, where we, like, brush over the things that didn't go well and talk about the things that did.
Yep.
And I think it's really important to understand, like, that people who are really successful did have a lot of these failures, and they felt like failures
Yes.
during
Mhm.
the process, and it felt really bad. So I don't know if you can tell us a little bit more about, like,
Yep.
how it felt in that moment,
I
and
can,
then,
yes.
like, what did you do to take care of yourself?
Mhm.
And, like, how did you start to work through it?
Yeah, so it felt terrible. So and my wife can attest, like, I was literally, like, pulling hair out, like, it became like a tick almost, and I was, like, super stressed, right? Because you got the cash flow crunch, right? Because I still needed to earn enough, to meet our expenses, and then when the project started to take longer than it was supposed to, well, now that margin is going away, and I'm not seeing new clients, so I'm like, "Okay, what am I gonna do?" Because I just there's no way that I could earn, this much without any new clients. So I got to figure out something to do. And like I'm trying out these different things. So I'm experimenting with doing a newsletter, or I'm doing a podcast, or I'm posting on LinkedIn, or I'm doing all this stuff and nothing's happening. Like there's no new leads. No one's reaching out to me. I'm doing all the networking. I'm meeting people. It's just not working. And so it was around 6 months in where I'm like, okay, I think by all measures that this is not going to work. And so I got to figure out something else to do. Um, and it's just like you do feel like a failure. Like I'm failing at being like supporting my family. Like uh, maybe I should have just stayed in my corporate job because it would have just been easier, even though I would be spending a lot less time with my family. Um, or like I'm not good at being an entrepreneur. Like I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do marketing. I don't know how to do sales. And feeling like an imposter. Like that was a really big one too. Of like, do I even know what I'm talking about with these people? Like I'm trying to work with senior executives and leaders, and they're asking me questions about stuff, and I'm like, I don't know. I'll figure it out, but I don't know. And and that's just like from my perspective. But when I talk to my clients, like my clients were always really happy with the work I was doing. They always thought I was a great addition to the team. And I was, coming up with insights that they didn't have themselves. So like in a sort of micro way, I was doing really well with my specific client because I had known them for a long time. And I was hoping that I could do that with other clients, and that just never happened. So then that made me feel bad, like I was failing. Um, and so I think it definitely didn't feel good.
Mhm,
And this is all knowing all the stuff that we know, right? Like, okay, we know
mhm,
that failure is the one of the best ways to learn. We know that you should expect failure. We know that like every decision you make is a bet, and there's always a risk of it going wrong. Um, but even knowing that in the moment, it sucks.
mhm,
Like it feels real bad.
mhm. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I actually wanna pause for a second and because I feel like this is stuff that we don't talk about this stuff publicly, Like, we keep it in until we're like, "Oh, we're ready to share it with other
Hmm.
people because we're
Hmm.
now in the place where things are better," and, like, I guess we are in that place where, like, things are better now, um But I think it's important to, like, really say, like, "This is what I was thinking in that moment."
Mhm.
And I actually I see Amanda saying she's appreciating the honesty, that there's, like, you can know things intellectually, but then have the feelings
Yes.
about them. And I actually wanted to ask the people watching this, like, does this resonate with you? Like, have you had feelings like this that are hard, like, just these hard to share feelings? And it's interesting, Cameron, I'm thinking about it because, like, I had my own, like, experience earlier this year in, like, December, January with, like, pretty, like, really serious self-doubt and feeling like I was failing. And it wasn't logical, like, no one else was looking at it from the outside and saying, like, "Oh, Jess is totally failing at all of this," right? It was internal. Um, and and at that time, it also was feeling like, it was like I knew all of the strategies, like I knew all of these things logically, but I just like could not get them to work. Or like I couldn't like I couldn't like really get myself to believe that they were true.
Mhm.
Um, and in my case, I actually, went and talked to my therapist about it and was like, "Hey, like I am dealing with this like serious imposter syndrome, like feeling like I'm failing, feeling like I have no evidence necessarily for any of this, but I have these feelings." And partially for me, it was like, "Huh, there might be something chemical going on and like maybe we should increase your meds."
Mhm.
And so and right, and there was that, and then obviously I did, like, therapy more regularly for a period of time that really, like, helped me sort of get past that, um, but yeah, so I guess what I wanna ask you is, like, how did you react? And, like, how did you work through it? Like, what steps did you take that were helpful?
So, I think there's a few things here. So one is that I don't think I did a good job with reacting to it,
Mhm.
because, like, I did not go and seek therapy. I would talk to my wife about it. I would talk to uh, group coaching. So I think the way that
Mhm.
I reacted to it was I had this support network of other coaches and consultants, and I've been part of another coaching community for a long time. And so that's where I would share, like, okay, I'm struggling with this. I can't figure this out. Do you have any advice? And that's, I think, what helped. Um, and just seeing other people going through the same thing. Like, there was actually, it's kind of interesting because during that time, everything that was happening in the macro, so like the Great Resignation, which I'm probably a part of, um, and then inflation going up, and tech funding going way, way, way down. So I was not the only one in my group coaching who was like, I'm having a crap year. Like, there were a lot of other people that were
Mhm.
like, my sales have dried up. Someone had to do another entire pivot for their business too. And so it, I was not alone, but I could also see like there were specific things about my situation that just ended up, how they were, and I couldn't really plan for that. Um, so it's not a good answer. I mean, like, I just sort of worked through it, sort of like,
Mhm.
just dealt with it, not in a great way, but just like, okay, what I knew is that I had to finish out my project, right? So it's not like I
Mhm.
could just quit, and I can't quit my client as I'm doing my project. So I knew, like, okay, the timeline is I got to finish my project. Once that's done, I could try to figure out something else. So what I did is, once that project was finished, I said, "Hey, could we do this other working model instead?" And this was about a year into it. So this was summer of 2023. And so I said, "Hey, client, what we did before, I didn't really like that. Didn't really work out for either of us. Could we do this new working model?" And that is what switched it from, like, okay, uh, this sucks to, oh, okay, this is a little bit better. So I would
Mhm,
say in the summer of 2023, which is so an entire year later, I was switched my working model to be a little bit better for me. So my
mhm,
stress levels went down. I was able to have like more fixed income coming in per month. And that's just, I just redid the way that I did the engagement with them. And
mhm,
that's when I realized, like, okay, maybe this working model is a little bit different or a little bit better for me with the way that I work and my scheduling and stuff. I think that this works better. And I think and I told you in group coaching, like, it's so much better with the way that I'm working with my client now. I set up a system, so I had more systems in place to help me, and it was working really well. And then, and then about 6 months into that, they hired some in-house people, and so they didn't need my services anymore. And so that was the point where it's like, okay, I knew that a year into it, this wasn't working, but I still had my client. So I thought, well, maybe I could just work with them on, it's almost more like a
mhm,
contract basis. And that has been
mhm,
working really well. Could I just continue doing that and then work on scaling my app? Because at the
mhm,
same time all this is happening, I'm like learning all this stuff about marketing and sales that I'm then applying into this other context for my product. And my product is being validated and that is gaining traction. And so
mhm,
it's another decision point of like, do I focus on this thing that doesn't really have traction, consulting, or do I focus on this thing that does seem to have traction, my app, and also brings me more enjoyment,
mhm,
right? So all this sort of comes
mhm.
together at
Yeah.
about a year and a half in, and that's when the pivot is executed. And now we're where we are
Mhm.
now, but
Yeah.
that was about a year and a half.
Mhm. Yeah, so I wanna step back for a second. So, right, I feel like from an external perspective, like, it seems like there's a couple of things that happen. So one was realizing, like, you're not alone,
Hmm.
like, people feel like they're failing. Like, that's it just is life,
Yes.
and
Hmm.
realizing that, like, it's not it's not just you, and it's not about you and your skills and your personality and who you right? That it's like it's a b right, there's so many things that are going into it that it's not yeah, that it's not just you experiencing this thing. I feel like is was an important realization. And then you say, like, you're like, "Oh, I don't think I dealt with it very well," but I actually feel like you went to communities to figure out, like, "Hey, this is a challenge that I'm having," and to get encouragement and support from them, and then you so quickly made some pivots, like,
Hmm.
you took what was happening and you said, "I didn't like this," and you said, "Okay, I'm going to take what I've learned and I'm gonna structure it differently." And from what I'm remembering, right, like, when you were working with that client, you were kinda like, "Meh, I'm just meh on client work, like, this isn't, like,
Hmm.
something I'm super excited about that I wanna be doing long term." And so I actually, when you were like, "Oh, yeah, my client hired in-house people," I was like, "This is your opportunity to actually,
Hmm.
like, start moving toward the stuff that you really are excited, and more passionate about." And
Yes.
so in some ways, right, from an external perspective, given that it felt crappy at the time, like, from an external perspective, though, it was like, this is, like, a real opportunity. And I'm actually curious if, like, with time, now that you've had some time between that happening and what you're doing now, like,
Hmm.
do you also feel that? Or do you wish that things were like, are you glad that things have shifted? Or do you wish they were the same?
Yeah, so I'm glad that things have shifted, because so one of the things that I learned was, like, if you want to do consulting, technically, if you want to look it up, usually they're called authority businesses, right? So it's an authority business model, and that authority business model has like patterns and practices that people put into place to make them successful. And one of those things is you have to show up in the community your target market that you want to help. And a lot of that is showing up in person at conferences and stuff like that, or doing speaking engagements or going on podcasts. And I just felt like at this point in my life, that's really hard for me to do. I can't just go to conferences every month. Like I have to be home with the kids. Um, and their schedules are different. My wife can't just take off. She only has 2 personal days a year, and she gets the academic calendar, so she has spring break and winter break and summer break. But between those, she has no time off, right?
Mhm.
So I
Yeah.
can't just leave, for days
Mhm.
at a time. And so it just wasn't a good fit. Like what I learned was like consulting just isn't a good fit for me right now with the way that my life
Mhm.
is working.
Yeah.
Um,
Well,
and
if I can jump in here,
yeah.
like, it seems like, right, you had 2 sort of competing values in
Hmm.
some ways, right? That it was like you both wanted to be really present with your family and available and, be a really present dad with your 3 young kids, and a really supportive partner to your wife. And you wanted to build this business that was gonna require you to not be able to fulfill that role.
Yep.
Right? And so, right, I feel like it makes sense that, given what I know about you and, like, the strong values that you have, that you're choosing to value your time with your family and being a
Yep.
present dad and partner over building this particular business at this time.
Yeah, and there's a big time component here that I learned over the year, which was like, oh, I don't have as much time as I thought I might. So you would think that after quitting a corporate job, I would have more time. But what I did not take into account was how much time it takes for my kids to live their lives. So the public school that my son goes to starts at 9 and ends at 3. So basically, that is my working day. And then you take into account half an hour to an hour lunch. And suddenly I work maybe 6 hours. Like I only have about 6 hours a day to work.
And you take into account kids get sick
Yeah,
and they
kids
end up
get
being
sick all the
home a whole
time.
bunch.
Yep. So during that first year, they were sick about every 2 weeks. And so I would have to watch them, right? Because my wife didn't have sick days. She only had a limited amount of sick days, and I was the one who was at home. So I had to watch them. And so that took out huge chunks of time. Plus they have days off. In fact, I just counted for this upcoming year, they have 35 days off. That's weekdays. And
Yeah.
that's from September to May. They have 35 days
Uh-huh.
off.
Yeah.
That's more time than like an unlimited PTO startup, right? So
Right.
it's like
Yeah.
I don't I so I basically I was doing consulting, which requires like a full-time commitment, at least for the first year or two. Like as you're getting a new business started, you need
Mhm.
that full time for that year and a half or whatever.
Yeah.
And I was basically trying to do that business, which requires full-time dedication. And I only had about part-time amount of hours that I could really work, per day. So I was working at night, to try to do stuff because I needed to get stuff done. So I was doing my
Mhm.
marketing and sales activities and stuff at night.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'd be up till 1 or 2 a.m. Right. And so that was also part of it. Is like that's what added to the
Mhm.
stress of like,
Yeah.
number one, this isn't working. Number two, I'm staying up all night and it's still not working. And I don't
Yeah.
feel good about that.
Yeah.
So that was
So
also a really major component to it.
yeah, yeah. So I wanna talk about, like, the next pivot then,
Hmm.
right? And so, so from the outside, I'm looking in and I'm seeing, okay, your client hires in-house people. And then you have this, from my perspective, a unique opportunity to, like, figure out what you want to do
Hmm.
and next. So I'd love for you to share with everybody, what did you shift to recently, like in the last 6 months once that happened?
Yeah.
Um,
Yep. So going back to the very beginning, I had 3 or 4 paths available when I quit, and so I basically just went back to those paths, and I was like, okay, what has been working? What's not been working? And what had been working during this whole time was still that contracting with the training company to create technical content. And so what I thought was, well, what if I could do that full time is sort of the question that I asked,
mhm,
because there's still risk involved in it. But the question was, did I want to go back to a full-time job? Which again, we've just established I don't have full-time hours that I'm available. So that would require lifestyle changes. I would have to send my kids to before or
Mhm.
after school care. I would have to, we'd have to make these changes. Plus, it would have to be flexible enough where I could take the days off for sickness and all that. So it was like a choice between, do I want to go back to doing full time work over here on this side, or do I want to maybe look at the training contracting? Could I make that work? And so I got my resume all polished up to try to see if I could do contracting at least on a part time basis. And when I reached out to some recruiters, like the tech market, even 6 months ago, it's like dried up. So he's like, no, we don't have any open opportunities right now, but I'll let you know if there's anything that comes up. And so I was like, okay, well, now my only choices are full time employment, 40 hours I got to apply to doing job interviews, or I could try to get this flywheel started for doing these courses and training. And so I decided that I would try that because it just fit better with the lifestyle. So if I could get that to work, then I don't need to worry about going back to work or getting a full time job. And so that's what I pivoted to. That's what I decided was now that I have the bandwidth, I know how to do courses. So it's a lot of training courses. There's some new opportunities that we're rolling out that I could do too. So I learned how to do that. And within a month, I was able to fill my pipeline with work. And now it's been full of stuff. So I always have like a continuous amount of work that's like in the pipeline. And it just takes care of a lot of the stuff that I don't have to deal with now. Like I don't have to deal with marketing. I don't have to deal with sales because the platform, that company takes care of all that. So it's really just it's really just lining up the work and doing it, and it's not even hourly, which is great too, so that I can optimize and be more efficient with like the way that I do work. And that's been just working out so much better.
Mhm.
I don't even use up all the hours in a week to work on stuff now. Um,
Mhm.
and so that's just been a much better fit. So basically, the answer is doing contracting, but like fixed time contracting, not doing like hourly
Mhm.
contracting, which is
Yeah.
another alternative that I could do.
Yeah, yeah. So what one thing that I thought was really interesting was, like, so I asked you a couple weeks ago, I asked you like, "Oh, so are you gonna be able to, like, scale back? Are you gonna, like, take the summer off?" Kinda thing, because 'cause that's been your goal since the
Hmm.
beginning, is
Yep.
like, "I wanna take the summer off with my family." Um, and you were like, "Well, the hours I work now, like 12 to 15 hours a week, like,
Hmm.
that's the scaled back hours that I wanted to work in the summer, but I'm just doing that all year now."
Yes.
Um, and
Exactly.
and, and so I heard that and I just thought, like, after, like, the struggles of, like, the first year, or the year and a half of being an entrepreneur, that, like, it feels like you've, like, settled into, like, your stride of, like, "Hey, I can cover my family's expenses by working 12 to 15 hours a week on this contract stuff so that you can be present with your family in the way that you want,
Yep.
and do things that you enjoy and are interested in, like building
Hmm.
your app and, getting back into, doing your DIY and building the
Yes.
office in your backyard and
Yes.
traveling with your family and all of those things. And so so I just wanna say, like, I'm just really impressed, by, like, I don't know, I being an entrepreneur, and even if you're not an entrepreneur, like, designing your life and building a life that's different is hard,
Hmm.
and, like, we're going to feel like we fail at it.
Yep.
And there's, like, it's just life, like, whenever you step out of your comfort zone, like, we wanna do everything perfectly the first time, and that's just not how it goes,
Hmm.
you know? But being able to, like, tolerate that discomfort, right? And to be able to reach out to the communities that you have to get support, and to say, okay, what am I learning from this and how do I want to pivot, right? Rather than, saying like, I'm so scared. I just need to go back to doing what I was doing 3 years ago or something.
Mhm, mhm.
Um, like I'm just very like impressed, and I feel like you actually worked through this in a way that's, I don't know, you say you don't feel like you worked through it well, but I feel like you went, like, through all of those emotions and you've come out the other side and you've figured out like, you've learned, you've pivoted, and, you're not that you're necessarily in the place that you're gonna be forever, but, it's kind of like we pivot a little bit and get closer and closer to the life that we want. Um,
Yep, yes.
yeah. So I wanna ask you one sort of final question. Um, what what advice do you have for people whose fear of failure is holding them back from building the life that they want?
Yeah, I think first it's important, it's like a mindset thing to just realize that every decision that we make is a bet. And I during this past year I read Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke, and I think one of the important takeaways from that for me is separating decision quality from decision outcome. And so we could say that my decision to do consulting at the time, with all the information that I had, was actually a pretty good decision, but the outcome was not what I expected. So the outcome was poor, but that's not because I made a poor quality decision. Now, if I had decided to go into consulting, it could be considered a poor quality decision because of all the new information that I know now. So I think it's just important to realize that every single thing that you decide to do, even if it's to do nothing, is a bet. Um, so if
Mm,
you think in terms of bets, then what you really want to do is try to minimize the downside, so minimize the risk. And I think what's like super important to take away here that we didn't talk about too much, but is important for like a financial independence community, is that we should have extra confidence because we have been building up um, uh, our way towards financial independence. So I mean, I said that I'm not financially independent, but we are maybe halfway there. And so you can use that as leverage, so whether that is like to take more risks, like to quit your job or to try something new, because you do have that to lean back on. Um, and I think that was one of the important takeaways of like, I could not have done this without coming across financial independence and working towards it like for the 5 years, because I started in 2018 is when I found out about financial independence. And we had about a 50% savings rate up until that year that I quit. So we're saving half our income, and so the funny thing that I wrote in my review, my yearly review, was that during this entire time, our net worth has been climbing. So I'm failing at a micro level, but we're succeeding at a macro level with our finances. So like even though it might feel like cash flow is tight, like you still have your net worth to lean on, and if that's going up, then you've got that extra boost in confidence. It's like it is really that
mm,
financial armor. And so it might be easier to wait until you're financially independent to like take these really big risks, but I say, like you can make these small pivots and make small changes, and even some big changes on your way to financial independence, because as long as your net worth is climbing, then you can you've got
mm,
that armor to lean back on.
mhm. Yeah. Right, and you're still, like, moving in, a positive direction. I actually
Yes.
wanna put
Yes.
I wanna actually put our sort of closing question for people up. I wanna hear what people have learned today, and what did you learn? Is there an action that you'll take as a result? And Cameron, I feel like one thing that I'm taking away from this conversation is this idea that building financial freedom helps us to build resilience,
Mhm.
like, in the face of failure, right? That, like, we can take more risks and we actually can absorb a little bit more of things going wrong, because we've built some runways and built financial freedom. And so and that's been a helpful thing to look at too for me as I've been building my business. Like, when Corey quit his job, we had a year where we were using some of our runway. And it's a little bit scary to do that. And but also being able to look at it and say, oh, well, the net worth is still going up. And, there's evidence that like we're gonna be okay and we're like never actually going to like be homeless. Right? That there's like so many steps in play, so many things that can be done in the interim, between, that and everything completely falling apart.
Mhm.
So yeah, I wanna thank you for bringing that up. And then I would feel like another thing that I'm taking away from this conversation that you talked a lot about was like the importance of having a community of support around you
Yes,
so that
absolutely. Mhm.
yeah, so that you can, go to those people and share like, "Hey, I'm feeling, like a failure right now, and I wanna talk through this." And sometimes it's helpful to just see that you're not the only one. Like everyone feels like this at some point in time, um, and that it's normal, um, right? Like, I'm not crazy because I'm feeling this thing. And, like, other people can be really helpful to, like, help to figure out next steps and solutions and making you feel like you aren't, alone. Um, I'm curious if you have anything that you are taking away from this conversation that you wanna share?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote down some notes on like takeaways, but I think one thing that has stuck with me, for those of you who listen to Choosify, the podcast, Brad Barrett has a nice quote that he says pretty often, which is easy choices, hard life, hard choices, easy life.
Mm,
Right. So, I mean, it was a hard choice to quit my corporate job. It was a hard choice to do a pivot, to throw away everything that I did and just say, I'm going to shut it down and try something new. But like I can see that the path
mhm,
that we're on is going to lead to an easier life. I mean, I mean, according to my projections, we'll be financially independent within 10 years. And so when that happens, um, like all this stuff that I'm doing is going to be worth it. And I get to enjoy, I get to enjoy that journey right now rather than having to wait. Um,
mhm,
so I think nothing really comes too easy. There's always
mhm,
You're always going to face failure, and I think being able to bounce back quickly is sort of what the
mhm,
skill really is that you learn, and that you realize that you do have a lot of different options, and usually more than you think you do.
mhm.
So
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
there's always some path you can take.
Mhm. Yeah, and what you said there, the hard choices leading to an easy life and easy choices, hard life. That also made me think of, like I think of the idea a lot of, like, you're choosing your hard.
Hmm.
So for me, right, like, the hard is sometimes feeling like a failure as an entrepreneur and doing this stuff. However, like, if I wasn't doing this, my hard would be, like, dealing with a boss every day who's, like,
Hmm.
telling me I
Hmm.
should be working more, or or like having to go into an office every day or working full time and not being able to like do these things outside of work that I want. And so for me, like this is a hard that I am more willing to deal with on a daily basis.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I see a couple of people sharing some takeaways. Anya says that she's 8 years into her software engineering career and thinking about switching to consulting. So this has been super helpful.
Hmm.
Um, and then Tammy says, I am still successful by investing while I'm transitioning. And then Danielle shares definitely a great reminder to frame failures as relatively minor within the big picture of success. I think that's a great takeaway as well, is
Mhm.
like, let's sort of step back and look at the macro level and not forget about that, as well. And then one last comment, the reminder that we have, quote, "financial armor," to lean on, and the quote about hard choices. Um, awesome. So, thank you so much, everybody, for being here today. One last thing that I want to share with you. So, I have a free resource that's available to all of you, which is a 6-day email course focusing on helping you to identify and work through fears and limiting beliefs. I'm going to drop that link into the chat so that you can download that, or sign up for that and start getting those emails so that you can, start figuring out what are these fears that are holding me back and how can I work through them. And then lastly, so Kamran, you're not a content creator in the finance space, but how can people find you if they would like to continue following your journey?
Yeah, so I sort of have three different personas. So depending on who you want to follow, what part of me, I think LinkedIn is a good place to start if you're a professional, and that's where I post professional updates, like work updates. If you want more of the financial independence slash summer lifestyle stuff, my Instagram is a good place to follow me. And then if you are a software developer, my personal blog, kamranicus.com, is a good place to follow
Mhm.
me. That's where I posted my year in review, and that's my audience
Mhm.
there is sort of software developers. That's where I do my
Mhm.
more long form writing and essays.
Yep. So kamranicus.com is a good
Yep.
place,
Hmm.
for that, and then they can probably find your socials and such,
Yes. Yep.
there.
I deactivated my Twitter, but I'm active on LinkedIn.
Yes. I also no longer do Twitter, so it makes sense.
Yep.
Or whatever it is now, X.
X.
Um, yes. So,
Zitter.
yeah, Kamran, awesome. Thank you so much for being here today, and until the next time, everyone who's watching, I will see you again in a couple of weeks.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.